My name is Dr. Neal Lester, and I am a foundation professor of English here at Arizona State University, and I also direct a university-wide initiative called Project Humanities, which seeks to get people across disciplines, across professions, across generations and communities to talk, listen, and connect. And we do that not only through research, but also through public programs. I was never really aware of race as an undergraduate, and that does not mean I was oblivious to it. It just means that in a very small undergraduate school in Georgia, it seemed that that I was sort of getting what I deserved in terms of working hard and getting good grades and being one of the few African-American males who was majoring in English. I guessed, and as I look back, that the racialized elements were there. But I never felt the sting of racism, except that I was in classes with people who were mostly white. As I look back at that, I see that that's a pattern that my education has presented even as I've moved into administrative circles. Being the only is not foreign to me. I've often been the only Black department chair at a large university, or the only African-American dean in a circle of 19 deans at one of the largest institutions in the country. I've become keenly aware of that, I think, because my research has intersected with those kinds of representations. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting to me in terms of being an African-American and being an African-American male in the academy is that I've had to kind of navigate what that means in terms of my research, what that means in terms of my service, and what that means in terms of my teaching. So more specifically, I majored in American literature as a graduate student. And I took my test in 19th century American literature, but all of that literature was primarily by white authors. And in my last couple of semesters of graduate school at Vanderbilt University, which is not predominantly of color, I discovered an artist, Ntozake Shange, in a drama class. And it was the play for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, written in 1976, and she was a wonderful Broadway pioneer in that regard in terms of talking about women's lives and language. But it was one of those plays that was done at the end of that class, and I was curious about it because I couldn't make it fit all those traditional plays that I had studied and had mastered. And, you know, I'd done my master's thesis on Tennessee Williams, so that felt like it was sort of in line with expectations of what a master's student might do at Vanderbilt University, even though Tennessee Williams offers his own take on what it's like to be a fugitive in American society because of his sexual identity, also because of the ways in which he sort of critiques certain institutions of the South and beyond. But when I became a graduate student studying that play by Shange, what I realized is that that was where my passion was in terms of finding an author or playwright and poet in this case who helped me understand and hear the rhythms of language that I was most familiar with. And in Shange, I learned about language, I learned about male privilege, I learned about relations between Black men and Black women. I learned that talking about women's realities meant that you were automatically talking about men's realities and their relationships with men. And so when I had my first undergraduate or my first tenure track position at the University of Alabama, I was offered the opportunity to teach drama classes. Well, teaching drama classes meant that I would teach all the Strindberg, the Chekhov, and all those people that you would do in an American drama class. But I threw in some Leroy Jones and some Adrian Kennedy and some Ntozake Shange and some James Baldwin. And what I noticed back then in the early the late 80s, is that my students were really excited about those new works that they had not been introduced to. And that's when the momentum and my passion exploded in terms of saying, this is what I want to do. And so my expertise in African American literature was actually quite incidental. And it was a choice that I made to focus on those texts, those authors who were not necessarily part of the canon at the time. Some of these authors have become part of the canon, but there's still a need to do what I do, which is to teach African American literature and cultural studies, because there is a perspective that is brought to this particular kind of segregated exploration that one wouldn't get if you were just talking about kind of mainstream authors and mainstream experiences. What's clear about these texts that I teach, whether they're about Black people or about women or about Black women or about Black men, it's always in the context of their experiences with this other world that certainly influences and impacts how you are and how you define your own identity. So it's been an intricate kind of weaving of personal as well as kind of research that helps me kind of understand better our lives and my life as a person of color in this country. Well, it actually, the interest in children's literature actually came about because I was dealing with Black women's literature. And this is where that sort of interesting tension develops when a Black male is writing about, particularly a Black heterosexual male is writing about women's issues, then there seems to be some potential suspicion about that. Like, why? And I do remember stepping into a trap that I had set for myself by not understanding fully what that means in terms of being invited into a cultural space and an intellectual space and just sort of jumping into it. So my work on Shange had led me to works on Adrian Kennedy and Lorraine Hansberry. And I'd had this interest in hair because I have a daughter. And when my daughter was born in 1989, I was the primary hair groomer for lots of reasons, one of which is my schedule allowed me to sort of get her ready for school, and part of getting ready for school was doing her hair. And since our daughter is biracial, that particular hair presented some challenges for my wife, who has challenges with her hair as an Italian American. And so all of that was sort of in the background, I see now, that led me to start exploring not only gender and race, but also the ways in which this manifests itself in the literature. And I presented as one of my very first papers as an assistant professor, a paper on hair in Adrian Kennedy and Ntozake Shange and maybe Lorraine Hansberry. And as I gave this paper, which I thought was an okay paper, finished giving it, I had a very, very distinguished female, older than I, stand up and say, we have done that. We have already discussed those attitudes toward hair. And I was so taken by that because it wasn't a kind of nurturing response. I don't remember who she was, and her identity wasn't important beyond the fact that this was somebody telling me that as a Black male, I was somehow moving into a space that was not mine to inherit. And one of the things that was clear in the comment to me was that I, as a Black male, had no real right to talk about Black women and their hair. I was trying to analyze a text, so technically I wasn't talking about Black women and their hair. Nevertheless, it prompted me to then focus on these issues of identity politics by looking at children's texts. And so that's when my interest in the gender and race politics of hair started to manifest itself in examinations of children's text. Another thing that I think becomes a little bit of a challenge, or certainly a concern, is why would a Black male be talking about children's text? and children's literature. And I say, well, part of that is because I have children and I am a father. And, I was combing my daughter's hair long before the gentleman whose picture went viral was combing his, two daughters' hair. And some people were excited about it. And other people said, well, that's what women, some women, many women do all the time. Until we get to the point where those things aren't, story worthy and they become so normalized, I think it becomes sort of exceptional. And I don't know if we have a throng of, we have throngs of male scholars who are writing about women's issues. It reminds me of one of the first and only pieces that I'm aware of. Certainly it was one of the earliest. I can't say if it's the only piece that has existed since then. It was probably in 1989-ish, and I wrote a kind of defense of Shange's presentation of men. And this was at the time when you had people critiquing her and Alice Walker and Michelle Wallace for their presentations of men, because somehow to talk about women's challenges with some men was to attack all men. So my essay Beyond for Colored Girls looked at Shange's representations of men, where many had deemed her a man hater or a male hater, when in fact that was part of the challenge of her as an individual, is that she really likes and loved Black men. So she talked about her relationship with those men. It didn't mean, for example, when you read For Colored Girls and Bo Willie Brown drops the children out the window, that was somehow representative of all Black men. There are Black men who beat their children and who beat their wives. But I didn't feel that I was somehow being attacked, because I don't do that. But it doesn't mean that I'm let off the hook, because I could very easily come in contact with men who do, and it becomes my responsibility to respond to that. So there are ways in which all of this in my head, I can, and on paper, I could put down in a very sort of coherent way, but I'll say none of that was necessarily choreographed or planned. It happened. And I hope that I've been a nimble enough scholar to have these things come together quite coherently when I look at my research profile over these, past nearly 30 years. I think a lot of what we've come to know, it's interesting when we start trying to talk about the history of something, because it suggests that there is sort of a beginning. And, I'm reluctant about going in that direction of saying, well, here's a chronology of the history of African-American children's literature, because so much of the history actually is a history of absence or misrepresentation. So I'll say, for example, Little Black Sambo, written by Helen Bannerman, who was not African-American, created that story allegedly as entertainment for her two Scottish children en route on a train to visit their dad. And Little Black Sambo is one of the most popular children's texts around the world. Now, is that part of African-American children's literature? I don't know. It's certainly a part of children's literature. It has this little Black boy in it, but the representation of that little Black boy is not all very flattering. And what I've been trying to do is to sort of look at how there are lots and lots of images of little Black Sambos and Epaminondases, and all of those sort of contrasted the folklore, where we'd have something like the signifying monkey who manipulates through language. So I'm saying that kind of absence first through Father, Mother, Dick, and Jane, and then later as misrepresentation through the Epaminondas and Little Black Sambo and the lots and lots of others that show, Black children in particular being eaten by alligators or being eaten by tigers or being chased by, all kinds of other animals, serve to kind of animalize children. All of those things, both in the literature, the books, but also in the popular culture, became ways of talking about children, not from the perspective of people who valued and who respected the identity of children and their parents. And it was not until we had during the Harlem Renaissance, books like the Brownies book, where we'd have people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes and others who were writing very positive stories, uplift stories, respectability stories about and for Black children. So the history is sort of interesting. It's like, what is the history of African American literature? Well, how far do we want to go back in terms of the literature? Because, as Toni Morrison has says, even when Black people weren't physically present, they were present in the minds of those white writers who were writing. So I say what we have noticed is a kind of move from absence to a kind of misrepresentation, a kind of ethnic notions, the Sambo, the Pickaninny, the Mammy, all of those characters were characters that had to be resisted. And I think the 1920s and 1930s and the Harlem Renaissance made very deliberate efforts to contrast that. What has evolved, interestingly, is that writers who are adult writers, and I'm thinking of Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, even Ntozake Shange, Whoopi Goldberg, Queen Latifah, Michael Jordan. I mean, there are a lot of writers and African Americans who are adult entertainers who are now and have written books for children and recognize the value of this audience building, but also character building and community building that starts there in children's text. And what's interesting to me is to see Alice Walker's story or Alice Walker's poem or Ntozake Shange's poem sort of put in a picture book format. And it shows us that there really isn't this disconnect between children and adult politics. And authors have been very interested and engaged in terms of responding to that need and also that challenge. Well, I'll offer as an example my work on the race and gender politics of hair. And I just guest edited an issue of The Lion and the Unicorn, which is an international quarterly of children's literature. And I sent the call out as the guest editor, and the call went far and wide, and saying, if you have anything that you'd like to submit in any format on children/childhood and hair, please submit. All of the submissions, and I think I had about 20 submissions, not one of those came in from a male writer, male scholar. I'll take that back. One came in from a colleague here because I'd reached out to him. And it was on young adult literature. It really wasn't on children's literature. And I do make a distinction. I talk about picture books versus those young adult ones, which are more novels. They have more words. They have fewer pictures. I also found that in what I received, none of the essays that I accepted and read through and considered dealt necessarily with boys. And so there are lots of books out there about hair, but those books are about, children's books are about females and hair. Now, while that's not surprising, because it's one of those things where we lump it into the ways in which women are valued based on, females are valued on the basis of what they look like. Are they attractive? Are they unattractive? And males typically aren't. But it reminded me that people hadn't really teased through the kind of connection between the way men help define aesthetics of beauty, or how men and males respond to aesthetics of beauty, particularly around hair. So if, for example, we've got a reference in a song about, running my fingers through your hair, that is probably not a female's hair that's being talked about. Because running a finger through an afro, or running a finger through cornrows, or running a finger through those more Afrocentric styles isn't the same as running your hair through long, silky Rapunzel hair that blows in the wind. So there are all these kinds of subtle ways that this notion of identity and adult politics and children's literature sort of feed to kind of help us understand, I think, the ways that, in this particular example, that hair can be used as a lens through which to read all of these. So it's a, you know, the gender is there, but it's sort of like when I talked about the history of the literature, sometimes the absence tells us more about what's present. So the lack of the few books about boys and hair, children's literature, sort of remind us that there are not many men writing on this, and somehow this issue is not about the value that men place on appearance, the value that men place on their own sort of bodies in the ways that we have stamped value onto women's bodies, and not just African American women, but women across the spectrum. Well, I have, because I do picture books, I'm just steadfastly committed to this notion that what we are exposed to as children is absorbed and it becomes part of who we are as adults. And that ranges from the Disney songs that many of us sing and internalize without knowing that that second verse, or that those are minstrel songs, and that second verse has the N-word in it, to greeting cards, to posters, to products, actually. I mean, I'm thinking of the song, and I'm using quotes, "The 10 Little Nigger Boys." That was actually a children's song that was used in 1890s to teach children how to subtract. And so you start with 10 little nigger boys, and one by one, the boys disappear through various, most often through various forms of violence. And so one is stung, one is cut in half, one is swallowed by a fish. And the very end, one is just, there's just so much destruction associated with black male bodies that the little boy just explodes in the sun. So, you know, and then I look at Little Black Sambo and I see, well, first of all, Little Black Sambo is little. So there's a notion that, you know, he's represented as diminutive and pet-like. And if you look at the picture of Little Black Sambo, he's got a big old smile on his face and the big red lips. And, you know, he's a skinny, frail, slightly undernourished little boy who at the very end of the story eats 169 pancakes, which is full of gluttony. And it sort of goes back to slave narratives. And if you read Frederick Douglass, for example, 1845, in his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, he says that on holidays, slaves would be let free, not free, they would be let free for the holiday to eat and drink themselves quite merrily. And slaves would often eat and drink so excessively that they would be sick. And they'd come back and say, you know what, I'm glad I'm a slave because I would hurt myself if I were free. So there are these ways in which these children's texts can very easily be matched to sort of these adult texts, but also these experiences that help us sort of read culture differently. And relative to the pictures, the stories don't exist without some illustrations, particularly in picture books. You can have young adult novels with no pictures in them. For picture books, the stories are just as, the illustrations are just as important as the pictures. And I'm talking about everything from Nappy Hair by Cara Olivia Huron, which is really about a little girl, little black girl, and she's a brown girl. She's not a light-skinned little girl. She's a brown girl, and she has nappy hair. And it really is a celebration of Brenda's hair. But in talking with the author, Cara Olivia Huron, Dr. Huron says it's interesting, the illustrator who did that didn't really know much about black people because that illustration has Brenda's hand, the palm of her hand, is the same color as the back of her hand. Or you look at these texts where clearly people haven't paid attention to black features and they sort of make these characters look like Barbie dolls dipped in chocolate, or everybody in the family is the same skin color. I mean, those are the kinds of clues that I talk about and that I pay attention to, both when I'm teaching and also when I'm looking at text as part of my research. So illustrations are extremely important, and illustrations can tell us as much about the politics as the story itself tells us. Well, I think what's happening now, as I've taught children's literature over the years, is that a lot of my my texts have moved away from sort of heteronormative text. So these are not just text about boys with girls that, you know, everything talks about marrying and Mother Goose, Georgie Porgy, who's kissing the girls and making them cry. But I'm moving toward texts that counter that. So I've taught a course called Countering Heteronormativity in and through children's books. And we look at everything from SpongeBob SquarePants to Perez Hilton's A Boy with Pink Hair. And that particular realm of children's literature shows that when you talk about alternatives to heterosexual relationships, these characters are mostly white characters. So Heather's has two moms, those are about white women. If you talk about boys or same-sex daddies, they're about white men. If you talk about transgender children, those are still about white people. So the children's literature has not evolved to the point where people of color are subjects, both visible and cultural subjects in these texts. So there's still an absence, and I look at this in terms of waves, and I see that, you know, even if you look at, and that can be paired very easily with, you know, our more traditional magazines for Black readerships. I mean, I'm still looking for covers, particularly now at Valentine's Day as we're approaching, and we see the covers of Essence and we see the covers of Ebony, and they're all with heterosexual couplings or pairings. You know, where are the two women who have been in stable relationships? Where are the two men who have been in stable relationships? So there's a way in which the children's literature has to kind of, in many ways, be the pioneer for that, so that folks can start accepting that relationships are relationships, and that every relationship doesn't look like, you know, the next relationship or the every other relationship. So the children's literature is evolving, and in many ways it is being a little bit more pioneering than some of our more traditional avenues of creative and self-cultural expressions. And again, all of that is very, I mean, all those characters who sort of, who show up in those or those other texts that break the mold are typically white characters. And there's still a lot more books about, you know, pairings of males than females. And, you know, even if you're pairing males and, you know, males with males and females with females, it's about the parents and not necessarily about the children. So my focus has been on, well, what about the children? Why is there this assumption that that all the children of same-sex couples are heterosexual? So, you know, and you don't have to talk about identity even in children's text and link that necessarily with sex. With sex. This is about sexual identity, not about sex. Well, I see the impact, so it's not about hoping what impact it will have. I guess if I hope that it continues. The impact that I see that it has is that people are reading and people are responding, and it's not necessarily all negative, but people are interested in what I'm writing and what I have to say. I guess if there was a legacy that I wanted to leave, the legacy would be that that I tried to say something that everybody wasn't saying, and that the scholarship and my teaching encouraged people to question and not so much find an answer, but to look at the possibilities in a range of responses and answers. But I also want people to recognize that even as I teach and write, I am also learning. And so when I sit down to write or stand up before an audience to teach, I am also listening to myself and learning. And, you know, that to me is the exciting part when I step into a classroom or when I sit down to write a blog for teaching tolerance or writing a longer paper to submit for an essay. I'm not writing that because I have an answer to something. I'm actually teaching that class or writing that paper because I have a question. And somehow teaching it and writing about it and talking about it helps me better understand what it is I'm trying to figure out.